All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We really appreciate it. We are very excited for tonight's session. My name is David Kaib. I'm one of the organizers of the Socialist Night School here at Metro DC DSA. My pronouns are he and him. At the end of tonight's session, we will announce some ways that you can get involved if you are so interested. The Metro DC DSA Socialist Night School is a series of sessions that explore basic ideas, concepts, and historical events related to socialism. We're in our 5th semester here. It's our 2nd that's entirely online. And we're very excited for tonight's session, as I said. If you have any problems with the audio or video as we're going along, if you can let us know in the chat, we'll appreciate it. We will have time at the end for questions. We're also going to have you involved in some discussion as we go along, so that's very exciting. And so let me get started with introducing Sarah. Sarah is the Type Media Center Fellow and an independent journalist covering the politics of power from the workplace to the streets. She's the author of Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt, and her new book is entitled Work Won't Love You Back: How Devotion to Our Jobs Keeps Us Exploited, Exhausted, and Alone. I highly recommend it. If you haven't checked it already, you should. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Unmuting myself helps. Hi, I'm Sarah. I wrote this book about work and how it's miserable and awful in a variety of ways. And so I'm going to talk about it a little bit, but David and I discussed this and decided that rather than having me talk at you on Zoom for a really long period of time that would make all of our eyes glaze over, we would try something different. So I'm going to lay out some basic things about the book and about work for about 15 minutes. We're going to then break y'all out into breakout groups of about, I think we decided like 4 or 5 people each. And we're going to ask you to talk about work, your experiences with work. We'll give you some questions to discuss and then bring that back, discuss what you all talked about a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit more, send you back to breakout groups again, and then come back and you can ask me any questions that your heart desires for the last however long that takes. So, because I've been doing a lot of talking lately and really thought that it would be nice to actually get some people talking to each other and also back to me about the things that you're thinking about work. So, that is how we're going to do things. So yes, I wrote this book, which is sitting behind me, which I don't know if any of you have it or have read it or have thought about reading it and wanted to cry. But it's about the way the labor of love is sort of the common sense around work in the neoliberal era. And what I mean by common sense is a thing that sort of, the way that Gramsci describes common sense is as a force that actually has weight in society. It actually affects how we live, whether or not we believe it. And we're sort of compelled to act as though we believe it, even if we don't. And let me tell you, it is whatever time of it is on Monday night. And this is going to be another long week for me not listening to the things that are written in my book. So it's a discourse that serves as a motivating tool to make us commit more fully to work at the same time as working conditions are getting worse for, broadly speaking, I mean, the pandemic has pretty much made working conditions worse for everyone unless you're Jeff Bezos and work consists of just waiting for the zeros to add on to your checking account. He doesn't have a checking account. They don't do that. Rich people don't have checking accounts, right? So working conditions have been getting worse even before coronavirus ruined our lives. And that was going on broadly for a few decades. Inequality has been growing. Worker pay is not keeping up with productivity. And production itself requires fewer people in order to produce the things that we all need to live. So the way that we think about loving our jobs, some people have kind of asked me, oh, but isn't this just for sort of, people with liberal arts degrees? And my answer to that is very much no. The other day I was driving from Philadelphia to New York and passed a billboard for an Amazon warehouse job, where you will get a job delivering smiles. I don't know if we have any Amazon warehouse employees on this call, and if we do, I would love to hear from you about how often you smile at work, because I imagine it's not very. But yet, that is still the story that we hear even about warehouse work. There are ads for passionate people to clean houses and clean hotel rooms and all of that jazz. So in the book, I divide this narrative into two halves, and I tell each of those stories through a series of workers who do a series of different types of work, some of which I'm sure we will have people on this call who do, some of which maybe none of you do. And the first half, I write about caring work. Broadly, I start this off with talking about the work that women have historically been expected to do in the home and how that expectation actually shapes what we think of as gender. So I move from sort of the history of unpaid work in the home to people's organizing around that today, through paid domestic work, teaching, retail work, and the nonprofit sector. That's half one. And the second half of the book, so we've been hearing a lot about one particular sector of caring workers these days. Or actually what's really happening is two sectors are being pitted against each other, because essentially we're being told that we need to reopen the schools and teachers need to go back in person because moms are exhausted. And not that moms are exhausted because we do not have any public policy to support parents. It's just that mothers are wiped because they're still doing most of the unpaid work in the home. And therefore we need to reopen the schools and push all the teachers back into the classroom. In many cases, which of course has already been reopened. There's a car alarm behind me, I apologize. So this narrative around teaching is very much what I mean when I talk about the labor of love and how it operates as both a sort of carrot and stick at the same time. So you love your job, you love the kids, right? The kids are great, it's wonderful, teaching is fun. So how dare you ask for a raise? How dare you not want to go back into the classroom as soon as possible, despite the fact that you might get COVID and die, the fact that you might spread COVID to your students who might bring it home to their grandmother who might die. You should still get back in the classroom because you love your job. And if you do not love your job, what's wrong with you? And you teachers are expected to solve all of the problems of a totally devastated social safety net by the power of loving the kids and their jobs. So that's the first half of the book. The second half of the book, I talk about the narratives around creative work. And we'll return to some of this subject a little bit later. But I start out with the history of the way we talk about art as not really work, as something that people do for the love of it, because it is itself enjoyable, because we're sort of specially magically gifted artists or talented geniuses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore the work they do is not really work and it doesn't need to get paid like normal work does. And if you happen to make money making art, you are a phenomenally lucky human being who, once again, should never actually talk about the conditions of your labor. From the artists, I move through the unpaid internship, which is the way that conditions of the service sector creep into all sorts of work, but particularly creative work. Then, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting my own book. Then academia, the tech sector, and sports, because I had to write about Colin Kaepernick and Megan Rapinoe. And so the tech sector, I think, is particularly interesting on this half of it because we hear a lot, once again, about how everybody should just learn to code, right? If you're losing your job at a factory that's closing down in your neighborhood, you should learn to code and it'll be great. You'll have a great job once you learn to code. The people who are programmers at Facebook or Amazon, once again, have these wonderful, exciting jobs where, there's ping pong tables and frozen yogurt and toys, and you can stay there all you want and they'll feed you and they'll basically do everything that your wife, and I do use the term wife specifically because these industries are built around an ideal of a male worker, does not do for you. So the way that narrative around this work being so uniquely exciting and fulfilling and sustaining, once again, that to actually question those conditions Well, we saw this recently when the Google workers, the Alphabet workers announced their union, and people immediately respond with, well, they're not coal miners. They don't need a union. These workers are too privileged to need a union. These are good jobs. Why would you possibly dare, once again, to say, maybe my working conditions kind of suck? So that's, in a nutshell, the shape of this book. And the argument that I'm making is basically that this is a political problem, that this is not a problem that we're going to solve with life hacks and with renegotiating individually our personal relationships with work. Trust me, I have yet to solve that problem myself. But instead, and I think all of you who are on a Metro DC DSA night school call are pretty aware that this is a political problem. That said, it is still a problem that affects us all in really deep and personal ways. This is why the title of the book is Work Won't Love You Back. This is why a lot of people have had really emotional reactions to talking about this stuff. Because it is hard, right? We do spend most of our lives at work. A lot of us have worked really hard to get to a point in our careers where we have a better job. Some of us are still perhaps in the period of our lives where we're trying to get into a better industry that we might like more than the one we're in. Trust me, I spent 10 years of my life waiting tables before I was able to actually make it as a full-time journalist. I don't want to go back to the service industry. I was a very bad waitress. I was not good at waiting tables. Sometimes I'm not good at being patient with journalism either, but that's another story. So I've been thinking about this book and talking about this book and the questions of consciousness raising. And I'm drawing this obviously from the 1970s feminist movement, but also more recently from the work of Mark Fisher, who in the last thing that he was working on before he died was writing about bringing back consciousness raising to have us think about our relationships with work, with capital, with pleasure, with change, with organizing. And so we thought we'd sort of run some of this session as like a little bit of a consciousness raising session. So we're going to ask you all to talk about your work with each other. We're going to have, like I said, small breakout groups that the Zoom technology, I think, is going to do for us. And David has done all of this. So thank you, David. And once you're in those groups, we're going to give you about 15 minutes to talk about a set of questions. We would love it if one of you would report back to us. And we want you to talk about what work you do. Is it paid? Is it unpaid? Is it well paid or poorly paid? Is it really seen as work? Is it seen as a real job? So, for example, I am a journalist. I wrote this book. I also write a variety of things for basically anyone that will publish me. It is considered a real job, sometimes in really annoying ways, where I am expected to be eternally grateful that I get to write things for a living because it's exciting creative work. Never mind that it's extraordinarily underpaid, exciting creative work. And yeah, it's taken me a while to get to this point because there is, despite it being a real job, it also sometimes straddles that line between work and not work. Between this is something that I did for free for a while until I was able to actually get paid to do it. So on that note, I'm going to pull David back in because he has more details on how we're actually going to do breakout groups, right, David?
I do, and also Stephanie is running the controls. She's the one that actually knows
Thank
what's
you,
happening.
Stephanie.
Thankfully,
you're
it's
welcome.
not just me.
Just let me know when you want me to hit the red button.
So yeah, what we're going to do is I'm going to drop in the chat a Google Doc, which I hope you will all be able to access. And it has the questions that we posed for you at the top, and it has segments for each group. So like we said, if one person in each group can take some notes for the report back for us, we will appreciate it. And then when we come back, I will read some of that stuff out to Sarah and we will talk about it. So Stephanie, if you can sort people into your groups, and I will share this document.
And you do not need to have had a very clear idea of the answer to any of those questions at first. We just want to get you talking and sort of thinking about your work and your working conditions, and maybe start to think about what we might do to change them.
Okay, well, Sarah, do you want me to read out some of these for our discussion?
Yeah, we can just pull a little bit of observations.
Sure. All right. I might bounce around a little here because there's a lot of stuff. Let's see. So, all right, to start off, we've got somebody who does drug policy / harm reduction. It's a nonprofit / grassroots organization for several years. It is paid, it's well paid in the grand scheme of things, but there's big disparities in the organization. Large nonprofit currently. Understood as a real job. Definitely the work is seen as work. It's a big organization. It's a quote, good job. Tech worker working from home. It's well paid. Seen as a real job. It is a real job. It's seen as work. They have questions about the long-term sustainability of the field, so automation and future generations. Got someone else who says they started out as a teacher and now they're working in education policy and is also a parent. So unpaid work, but they have a good partner who helps out. Hates the job at the large government contractor. Toxic culture in the department. Having an identity crisis. Educational equity means having equal access to the tools of capitalism, and struggling with the diagnosis of ADHD. Got someone else here who says, currently unemployed and looking for work, writing for an academic journal, which hasn't seen money yet. Academic work doesn't feel like a real job, feels more like freelance. Before that, they worked in Spain as an English teacher and liked that. Got another person here, student staying at home, but still having to come in to participate, have to download lockdown spyware. So go in partially. They also have a part-time job working at an auto recycling center. It pays okay, but I guess most people would consider it a real job. Not sure it has any meaningful impact. Let's see. Here we've got labor researcher by day, DSA working at night, weekends in the morning, housework, no kids. Last job was not well managed. Issues fell upon the lower employees to solve. Maybe I'll do one more. We've got barista to nonprofit work, which are somewhat similar. Not considered a real job, especially to customers. Joined the DSA, then the pandemic hit and was laid off. Works in labor rights and nonprofits, still needs to organize in their workplace. Work feels easier, family thinks it's a real job now.
Yeah, I mean, several of you are making the same observation that I make in the book, right? Which is that like moving from the service sector to nonprofit work doesn't feel all that different a lot of the time. And that these sort of shifts between what is and isn't supposedly a real job are a lot blurrier than we think, but there are certain social expectations of certain things being work and certain things not being work, and how we sort of respect and value those different things. I love the note that, yes, you work in labor policy and yet still have to organize on the job. And the education nonprofit, which was in my breakout group, doesn't give its workers paid family leave, or they had to fight for it. So, we're doing great. Education workers. The New York City public schools, the last time I checked, still didn't have paid family leave, which is bonkers. Although it is actually really telling to me the way that like the discussion is going now, as if teachers are not also public school parents, but teachers are sort of just like robots who come in from elsewhere and aren't actually humans who also have lives and children of their own to worry about, especially in a field that is 70-something% women. the idea that we're sort of pitting like moms against teachers is like, no, you're actually trying to divide people in half. So for the second half of our little conversation, one of the things that I really wanted to get at while writing about this book, or writing this book, was the idea of class composition, which is the idea that class is not a set of characteristics that you have, that I am white and Jewish and what is my class background? Well, my family owned small businesses. So when I was a kid, we were really well off. And then my dad's businesses went down the toilet. And for a little while, we survived off of my mother cleaning houses for a living. And then eventually my dad bought another small business. And so we were like, you know, fairly stably middle class. I have a ton of student debt that I finally paid off this year, age 40. And I am in the apartment of a friend of mine because I still do not have a permanent living situation for the last couple of years. So class background, class position, it's complicated. And I love the way E.P. Thompson writes about class as when some men, and yes, he did say men, I'm sorry, as a result of common experiences, inherited or shared, feel and articulate the identity of their interests as between themselves and as against other men whose interests are different from and usually opposed to theirs. So that we understand class as a relationship, not just a thing that you either are or are not. The way Marx writes about this in some ways is that at some points you are acting as a worker, at some other points you're acting as something else. That's not even sort of a permanent state of being that shapes every day. And I write about work because work is where we experience class the most, although it is certainly not the only place that we experience this and that we are acted upon, that we have power sort of pressing down on us. So despite the really annoying way that politicians and some journalists talk about the working class, it is not actually a fixed category or stable category at all. It's a thing that changes as conditions change, as capitalism has changed. And so the argument that I'm making in this book is that the labor of love is the work ethic for this particular period of capitalism, that we are expected to love our jobs and to do our jobs because we find them meaningful and important. And this is something that has happened because the working class, as it existed previously, was decomposed and recomposed. So the process we call class composition is something that was theorized first by some Italian Marxists in the 1970s as this process of composition and decomposition was ongoing. It occurs as the workers whose labor and lives have been organized in one particular way by capitalism actually begin to understand themselves as a class and to act collectively as a class. The editors of Notes from Below, which is a UK labor publication that I quite like, describe class composition as a material relation with three parts. The first is the organization of labor power into a working class. That is a technical composition. The second is the organization of the working class into a class society, social composition. And the third is the self-organization of the working class into a force for class struggle, political composition. So that is what DSA and other socialist groups are trying to accomplish, that last bit there. So we can see the process of class composition happening as workers, for instance, who might have assumed themselves middle class, start to understand that their relationship to power is actually not all that dissimilar from other people who are very much considered part of the working class. As workers in the tech industry form a union that organizes all of the workers at Google from top to bottom, right? Or as fast food workers who were mostly ignored by the labor movement for quite a long time are suddenly at the forefront of our conversations about who are workers. So working class life is, of course, shaped by the world outside the workplace as well. It is shaped by a housing crisis and the cops, by fights over education, and the fact that in the US, most of us don't have very good access to healthcare. It's shaped by one's relationship to immigration and the fact that ICE is still deporting people. Sorry, Joe Biden, you haven't stopped it. The way that technology affects us on the job, whether somebody in one of the groups mentioned that as a student having to download spyware onto your computer, or your boss putting spyware on your work computer, or the scheduling software that makes your schedule if you work in retail or service, that sort of slices 15 minutes off there and leaves you on call over here. Or the technology that you might use if you drive for Uber or deliver for DoorDash. So all of these things shape our experience of class now, and they are changing, but also still many things that, as the first list of things showed us, we often have in common. And one of the key things that most of us have in common these days is we are expected on some level to find some meaning and even love for the work. So yeah, I've got a few minutes left. The way that I think about this and the way that I think that this composition began was that the process of deindustrialization that starts in the 1970s with economic and political crisis, and then with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and their buddies deliberately crushing the labor movement, destroying entire industries, privatizing everything they could get their hands on. That accelerated this process of decomposing what working class life had looked like, whether that's in social housing in the UK, or that's just your factory is gone and the only thing that has replaced it is maybe a Walmart warehouse. So as production shuts down in the rich countries and gets shipped overseas, or just automated away, or just, we don't do it anymore, you see the shift from workers at factories going on strike to raise hell and cause trouble to making demands for the factory to stay open. Comrade Joshua Clover, in his book Riot, Strike, Riot, calls this the affirmation trap, where labor is locked into the position of affirming its own exploitation under the guise of survival. I love this. I think this is a very useful term. And I think it is a very short step from the affirmation trap to the labor of love. So we like our jobs. We want to keep our jobs. Please, Mr. Boss, can I have a job? Job creators, all of that nonsense. But of course, the jobs that replace the factory jobs, most of them are in retail, in services, in healthcare and technology. We hear a lot about the knowledge economy, but mostly we're far more likely to be in service work. And those jobs, of course, have their very own expectations, the affirmation trap, the service with a smile. So as more and more of us are falling into jobs that require some version of this labor of love, as the fields adding the most jobs are nursing. Before the pandemic, it was food service. It is, I'm sure, still home healthcare, gendered jobs where you're expected to care, or the tech work, computer programmers, higher salaries, journalists like me. That are rooted in these old notions of artistic work, here as we go back to the shape of the book. And I stole some of this, or rather I was shaping the book, and then I read Luc Boltanski and Yves Chiapello's The New Spirit of Capitalism, where they argue that part of the story too, and I think this is also really important for organizing purposes to think about, is that capitalism also changed in response to struggle. Right? This is the dialectic. This is how the world moves. And so the social movements of the 1960s and the 1970s made a couple of kinds of critique of capitalism. And Boltanski and Chiapello divide these by, well, there are 5 in the book, but the 2 that I think are important right now, and the 2 that really came out of the movements of the 60s and 70s, are what they called the artistic critique, which was a critique of the conformity of mid-century capitalism. Capitalism is boring. Working for the same factory for 40 years sucks, actually. The gray flannel suit is bullshit, all of that. And then the social critique, which is still the critique of inequality, that some people have a ton and other people have access to very, very little, that very few have, again, decent healthcare, real control over our living situations. Most of us are increasingly facing what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment. So in those 60s and 70s movements, I write a lot about the plant at Lordstown in Ohio I don't know if I have people on who are familiar with Lordstown, but it was sort of famous in the late 60s for being a place where the workers raised hell and where this sort of artistic critique was happening. This was also coming out of workers in Italy, where people were theorizing the idea of class composition to begin with. And we're saying that actually, like, this work is kind of crap. Like, the idea that we want to be in a factory for 40 years and then retire is maybe not what we want at all. And notably, even sort of the unions were caught flat-footed by these kinds of refusals of work. And this was where the sort of two critiques got forced apart. And the thing that I take from Mark Fisher, which is why I'm circling back to the idea of consciousness raising, is that we actually need to find a way to make these critiques come together. That the demands to be your own boss and enjoy what you do are, in a way, a response to actual demands that workers were making. They're crappy responses because capitalism is not actually capable of giving us what we need, nor, is it remotely inclined to. But they are nevertheless responses. And so we do have to think about the way that the demands we make get sort of twisted and given back to us. So now, what we get in the labor of love is all of these traits that we might have wanted to use more of when factory work was the dominant form of labor. That creativity, people skills, caring. Now your boss wants all of that, and actually it's more exhausting than ever. And the fact that it was supposed to make work less miserable just means that we all work all the damn time. So that's my rundown on what I think is happening and what I think has happened to the working class and why we are where we are. And the challenge that we have as the left, and I do not actually have all the answers to this by a long shot, but one of the reasons that I want to have this conversation in groups with people rather than just talking at you is to get at what we think the working class is now, what we think is going on with this process of class recomposition right now, and what maybe can be done to further organize, hasten some sort of class consciousness development. So we have a few more questions for breakout groups. And I think we have it set up so people will just go back into the same breakout groups, yeah?
I think so, right, Stephanie?
I can, yeah.
That would be amazing. Thank you, because that'll be easier, then we don't have to reintroduce ourselves. So we have a second set of questions, which are going to go back into the Google Doc. Yeah, awesome.
There's a new Google Doc link, new link for a new Google Doc with
new
questions
Google
in it.
Doc. Oh,
Yeah.
You're so organized. I love it. This is great. So we want to talk about what is the working class? How has it changed over time? How have you seen it change in your own time at work and political organizing? How have you seen it change in terms of the workers that we see sort of publicly taking action and getting media attention? And the demands that those workers are making, how are those changing maybe? And we're going to do another 15 minutes-ish on this. And then, we'll come back, get some more report backs, and then you can ask me any burning questions that you might want to ask me.
David, I was just in room 11.
All right. Did everybody manage to get access to editing the doc that needed to get access to editing the doc?
Yes, night school is also work that sometimes isn't done well. Mostly it's done well.
Somebody says their note taker didn't get access.
You could also, if you have notes, you could pop them in the chat now as a.
Oh yeah, it popped up in my email inbox, the invite to edit. So after I requested it. So anyway, do we want to pull a few things out of there and then we can do a more sort of whatever kind of Q&A. But I'm interested in the conversations that folks had on this subject.
1 second, someone is requesting access manually. See if I can do that real quick. Okay, here's some of the things people said. Actually, we'll start with Rachel since it's right here in the chat. So group 4 talked a lot about how an expanding notion of the working class is probably super useful, but also dilutes what makes working class art, language, culture so meaningful. And from group 5, they said they talked a lot about the professional and the managerial class and whether they're in the working class. Good questions. Let's see what else we have here. Group 6 talked about the working class is more broad as we see the wealth inequality gap grow. They talked about professional employees recognize that they have a higher position, but that position is deteriorating. Conflicts with employees, changing the perceptions of worker identity, pressure from the gig economy to reassert workplace discipline. The rise of the so-called essential worker in food service and grocery stores. Fight for 15 is still stalling as a political demand. And that leads to the question of non-essential workers, so-called. So much is taken from working people. Will we put more qualifications and rights and privileges based upon jobs? In group 7, they talked about someone wrote somewhere, maybe in an article, that it rejected the middle class even exists. That maybe it's a tool we use to box ourselves into to define what we deserve or don't deserve to speak up on. Middle class people might have a tendency to avoid complaints, but people want to be middle class, so they box themselves out of demanding better. Someone else said that working class still has the stereotype of manual labor, but now many people work in service jobs, call centers, that sort of thing. Middle class as a concept was contested during the financial crisis. People in the financial sector who thought they were better might not have labeled themselves as middle class, but even they felt the effects of the financial crisis. Some found themselves on food stamps. In group 10, they made the important point that we should make sure to include in so-called invisible workers, the undocumented. Mm-hmm. Someone suggested that there might be a distinction between labor and the working class, maybe hourly wage workers versus salary, but maybe those are just subcategories of the working class. And they also asked the all-important question, police, are they working class? In that same group, they mentioned if you're same group, they said if you're in management, you're not in working class. but sometimes you can still be a lower level manager and not counted in your union bargaining unit.
Oh, and the favorite tactic of the union busters these days is to name more people managers than are actually managers to shrink you out of the bargaining unit. So often the real test of whether you're a manager is whether you can hire and fire people. And if you cannot, you should still be allowed to be in the bargaining unit. Of course, the lawyers will end up fighting that one out forever, but hopefully the new NLRB will suck a little bit less on that front. We had something from group 2 also in the chat here about the loss of cultural identity, which somebody else also noted within the working class. And yeah, I think this is a really important point now, is that like, so yesterday we got the stats on how many strikes there had been in the last year. And the answer is not many, but also some of the strikes that I've covered in the last year aren't counted in those statistics because they were less than 1,000 workers. Because the Bureau of Labor Statistics only counts strikes over 1,000 workers. But some friends, the folks at Strike Wave, had done a study and looked at how many workers were in the average union election over the last several years, and the average bargaining unit was something like 20 workers. So clearly our statistics are a little screwy because they're skewed back to a time when most people worked in really big workplaces. And now we don't. Now we are much more atomized. And again, this has been done as a management tactic in a lot of places, right? To make sure that, you know, places like Amazon have a bunch of temps in addition to their full-time employees. Google has different badge colors for different workplace statuses. And you can literally have 5 different employers in the same workplace. One of my favorite stories was, a few years ago, I was in Georgia reporting on temp agencies in manufacturing, and I was talking to somebody who worked at the Glock factory making guns outside of Atlanta, and was literally hired through a temp agency that was literally called Automation, because you can't make this shit up. Automation. It's not actually Automation. It's a temp agency called Automation. So yeah. So many of these things. But what does it mean to think of the working class as a unified thing when it's no longer in big, massive workplaces that it's easy to have a culture in? How do we create that elsewhere? This is, you know, one of the huge challenges I think we have right now. I don't know, do we want to pull anything else out of these? Our group talked a little bit about that sort of middle class mentality, the be your own boss thing that even some Uber drivers are like, no, I'm my own boss. I don't want employee status. I don't want Uber to be my employer. The way that people react to teachers making demands, but also to all sorts of workers, is to sort of say like, I should have pulled my, you know, you should pull your way up the way I did, you know, the way the bootstrap mentality continues to hang on and prevents people from sort of realizing and having solidarity. And instead we get sort of negative solidarity, right? Where people are like, well, why should teachers get, you know, whatever it is, the thing that people are demanding? I don't have that. And it's like, you should have that. We should all have that, in fact. But teachers having it doesn't prevent me from having it. Or teachers having, you know, a defined work day isn't the reason that I don't. Right? My bosses, well, I'm freelance, so that's my own problem. I just muted myself by accident. There we go. I don't know how much longer we normally go, but I'm happy to, if people have like actual questions they wanted to ask me about the book or anything, happy to just like take some questions for a little bit.
Yeah, so if you have questions for Sarah, you can put them in the chat. I will read them out and we'll go from there.
Or if you just want to share thoughts on, you know, what parts of this conversation were interesting and useful, and if you think it's a format we should replicate. And that alarm is still going off behind me. I am going to kill someone. I really hope it ends before I need to go to sleep. Somebody says they love the small group opportunity. Good. I did too.
Excellent.
Okay. Great. Excellent. Very good. Very good. I believe we are archiving the sort of talk portion for YouTube. Yes. So that's.
We will definitely post it on our website, and it probably will be on YouTube. But yeah, and we'll post that at the end.
Yeah. So thanks. Good. I'm glad that people enjoyed this format. I did a couple of sessions a couple of years ago now. Oh my God, time flies when you're in a pandemic. And yeah, I thought it was really a great way to get us thinking about some of these subjects. All right, we got some questions. There we go. Now they're coming.
Just takes people a little time.
There we go.
So Rachel said, Sarah, you're the best. I agree.
That's
First of all,
it's not a
but
question.
then second of all, yeah. At the end of the book, you suggest that we sort of stop loving work and focus on loving each other, which yes, but we all kind of want to love work. Can we preserve that while we work for better labor conditions all around?
I think that this is the real challenge, right? That we all sort of struggle with is we all want to do things that are meaningful, but what does that have to be our job? Or how do we think about work and a relationship to work? And I think the bottom line is you don't have to sort of let go of enjoying what you do. I'm not planning on going back to waiting tables anytime soon. I mean, first of all, like, even if I got screwed by journalism right now, it's not like there are waitressing jobs in a pandemic anyway. But I don't want to return to the service industry. I did not like it. You know, I plan on continuing to do this work that I do, but it's a question of recognizing that it's still work. And that has to be at sort of the basis of our demands and our understanding of the way the world is set up, is that like, we might have chosen very differently if we actually chose how to run things. I know this is the point where I'm like going to end up plugging other people's books, but I just finished reading Aaron Bananov's book on automation and the future of work. And he goes further down the road than I do of thinking about what a sort of post-scarcity society might look like. And there's a line in there where he says, abundance is a social relationship, that I'm like threatening to get tattooed on me because I just think it's so good. And that's actually what I want to be aiming for, and thinking about, you know, the questions of the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom that he takes from Marx, I think are really interesting. But, and like, would some of the work we do now fall into things that we would still do in our free time in that realm of freedom? Maybe they would. Maybe some of it is stuff that will still fall into the realm of work, but we still have to do it. But we can think about ways to make all work less sucky, right? I worked in restaurant jobs that were pretty good, that like I got along with all my coworkers and my boss wasn't a jerk. And that, you know, it is possible to make all these jobs better. And I think that's the challenge, is to not sort of fall into this idea that there are good jobs and there are bad jobs. That my sort of elevator pitch for this book was like, David Graeber bullshit jobs, but what if all jobs are bullshit, actually? And also that all jobs could be better.
Okay, next up, Claire says, unfortunately, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm wondering about the intersection from some of your ideas with concepts from Wages for Housework. Federici talks about socialized conceptions, which end up hiding work that is work and making it invisible. And I was thinking if this is sort of happening with the whole make your work your passion. Alternatively, this is your passion, so you should work for free narrative.
Yeah, I could not have written this book without the Wages for Housework folks and the work of Federici and Selma James and all the rest of them. And there are taglines and chapters that are taken from Silvia Federici. And yeah, absolutely. Like the wages for housework analysis, they also used it to apply it to paid care work as well, right? To say that this is the work, the way that it's drawn from our, unpaid work in the home. And this is why we devalue the work that is supposedly done by women. This is the way that sort of gender is formulated. I draw a lot in chapter 1 on the argument in Caliban and the Witch that the witch hunts and that period of accumulation actually, among other things, sort of created the thing we think of now as gender. So yes, Sylvia Federici is the best. I'm really mad that somebody profiled her in the New York Times this week and it wasn't me. I'm sulking.
Okay, next up, Rose said, love the section on domestic labor. Is it true that domestic workers are still not legally protected as workers?
It depends on where you are, but yes, they are still not included in the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act. So if you are in one of the, God, you know what? It's 8 o'clock and my brain is shutting down and I don't remember exactly where the states and cities that have domestic workers' Bill of Rights are, but otherwise there are not a whole lot of legal rights in a lot of this country for people who do paid domestic work and certain kinds of home care work. It's bullshit and it's racist.
So while we wait to see if anyone else has a question, I'm going to ask one of my questions.
There was one up here about
because
Mark Fisher's theorizing around accelerationism.
Oh, I missed that one. We should do that one.
I mean, this is my favorite topics. Yeah, I mean, so I talked about Boltanski and Chappello, but I also draw a lot on Mark Fisher in this book. You guys just understand me. It's cool. And the way that, that capitalism is sort of constantly trying to absorb those desires and then is still kind of shit at doing so, right? It's really not that great at actually giving us what we want. It's great at sort of creating new things that we should want. And then when those are unsatisfying, no, you can buy more. If I buy this really cute jumpsuit, then I will feel better about everything. And it is a cute jumpsuit and I do really like it, but it hasn't actually made my working conditions better. And I think that this moment when we're thinking about the way that neoliberalism sort of pulled these desires that workers were making demands around in the 60s and 70s and said, okay, cool, you don't want to have a boss? We'll give you Uber. You don't want to have a boss? You can all be freelance. Like, it's true, bosses do suck. However, I don't actually live a boss-free life. I actually have to worry a lot about what other people think about the work that I'm doing, maybe more than if I just had one workplace. And that challenge of pulling that back and saying, actually, there's a wonderful line in the Acid Communism fragment where he says, our desires are nameless. We don't know what they actually might be yet because we're still embedded in this system that produces things we ought to desire, but we know that we want something else. And that's why we're all here, right? Having this conversation, as we know that the way that shit is set up right now is not actually satisfying our wants and needs.
So Graham asked or said, this is a problem everywhere, but how much of this unhealthy love affair with work is specific to the USA?
So I think we've exported it a lot, but I actually did a bunch of reporting outside of the US for this book. So I spent some time in Canada, I spent some time in the UK and Ireland. I talked to workers from Germany and France, and I also just read a lot of things from other places. So it is actually striking how this thing that we often think of as super American is in fact much more global, and in some cases, that is the fault of America as sort of global hegemon, is that we've exported a lot of awful things, including a terrible workplace culture. So there are differences. I spend a lot of time in the UK these days, and I really love actually that when I go places, the first thing people ask isn't, what do you do? That I have a good friend that I met at a sort of lefty drinks night, and we had been talking to each other for 10 minutes before somebody else asked him what he did. And he said, oh, I work at Verso. And I was like, oh, you're that John. And we realized after we had been talking for 10 minutes that we actually did know who each other was and were familiar with our work and blah, blah, blah. But the point was actually that we got on whether or not we knew what the other one did for a living. So there are differences, I think, but it's particularly toxic in the US, but it's certainly also true in a lot of places. And also really because like these industries are global. When I was talking to video game programmers, you know, they're literally working in companies that have, you know, they're working with people in Canada and they're working with people in California and they're working with people in India all on the same game. So the workplace culture spreads because these companies are truly everywhere. Oh, the comment about in Spain, the decline of siestas. Yeah, this is garbage. I'm real mad about this because the first time I went to Italy and I was trying to go to a museum and it was closed for 2 hours in the middle of the day. And at first I got like Americanly like mad. And then I was like, no, wait, this is amazing. Everybody should get 2 hours off for lunch in the middle of the day. This is wonderful. I'm going to go have a nap. And yeah, so the decline of that makes me very sad because I really, I want to live somewhere where we have 2 hour breaks in the middle of the day. 3 hours. He says 3 hours. Shit. I should have gone to Spain.
Claire asked if you have thoughts on the UBI and how that could potentially change our societal relationship to work.
I mean, the question of the UBI, I think I would love one. Please give me money. Give me a check. I actually have a fellowship from the Type Media Center that allows me to keep doing what I do. And so from my very exciting research, a UBI would be a wonderful thing. I still work. But the question that worries me about this is that like Andrew Yang is a nightmare. I'm in New York and he's running for mayor of New York right now. And I mean, it's sort of hilarious because he probably won't win, but like if he wins, this guy actually has no clue how to run anything. And it frightens me. So I worry that the UBI we might get would be at the expense of destroying what's left of the social safety net and be the sort of right-wing UBI that, you know, that essentially just like tries to give poor people enough to keep consuming so that we can keep buying smartphones and being on Facebook. That said, I want one. And I think that anything that separates work from income is good. And the people who were pushing for a basic income at the time that the US ever came the closest to having one was the welfare rights movement. And I basically think the welfare rights movement should have gotten everything they wanted. So, and they were very clear that they wanted this, A, because everybody should have it, but B, because the work that they were doing in the home raising children was already work. So, yes, these are my lukewarm takes on UBI. Guaranteed minimum income and UBI there's a variety of sort of terms for basically the same thing, but the term that people use for it is less important than the details of what they're proposing. Some people will call something a guaranteed minimum income that is good or bad. Some people will call it UBI and it can be good or bad. There's a negative income tax, which is Milton Friedman's idea. But rather than trusting the name people put on it as being the good thing or the bad thing, check the details because a lot of people mean different things by the same term.
All right. So Claire said, I know you just said we don't really know our desires right now.
I mean, I know some of them.
I got a few. But do you have any ideas on what we could desire for, especially a more abundance rather than scarcity mindset, or things we definitely need to change so that we can start knowing our desires again?
Yeah. I mean, there are some things that I think are really that we do know, right? Like I want to go on vacation with my 5 best friends and just like lie on a beach and like touch people because I'm living alone in lockdown and it really sucks. So there's like sort of basic level stuff that I think the pandemic has actually really ramped up because all of those sort of semi-capitalism induced desires are less present right now, right? There's not much I can do other than look at Facebook and like I'm real bored with Facebook. So I do think there's a way, and like Mark Fisher also wrote about this, right? About sort of the importance of boredom. That there are ways that we can sort of find our way to thinking about what we might want if things were actually different. Yeah, and it's less that like, I don't think it's possible to know what you might want right now. I know a lot of things I want right now. But more that like, the more we change things, the more we will create new desires in the process of change. This is also the dialectic that like, this is what revolutionary movements do, is they produce desires in the process of becoming. And I can sound really corny when I talk about this stuff, but it's also sort of the reason that like at the end of this book, I didn't want to just like lay out the program for like, this is what our lives will be like. These are the policy proposals that I want, where like a 4-day week and a basic income and all of these things that I think would be awesome. But also like, I think we actually have to create these things in movements collectively, and not just like me sitting in my room writing a book.
So there's a bit at the end of the book when you talk about the movement of young people into political organizations like the Labour Party in the UK or DSA. And you say that it's not just about a political awakening, but a desire for connection and purpose. And that line really stuck out at me. And I was thinking about it also because so many people talked about their work in DSA when they talked about their work. But I'm wondering if you can talk at all about what you were getting at there, and like what it is that what are people missing when they don't understand that?
Yeah, I think somebody actually had a question about the idea of solidarity too, and that making things more meaningful, which I think this is all connected, right? That like, yeah, the more atomized we become, the more I've been thinking about it as like Margaret Thatcher units, because Margaret Thatcher, of course, said, you know, there are individual men and women and there are families. And so I've been thinking about like lockdown is basically separating us into little Margaret Thatcher approved units. Or you can sort of be in the nuclear family, or you can be alone. Maybe you have roommates, which I don't know what Margaret Thatcher thought about roommates, but she certainly created a situation where a lot more people have them. So, and that's like, we're so lonely and so isolated. And this was already a problem before, again, before COVID, and COVID just made it 10 times worse, that you see this coming through in the movements of the last several years. So you see the squares, you see Occupy, you see, you know, Syntagma Square and Gezi and, you know, Tahrir and all of this, that like all over the world, when people think about how to revolt, the first thing they do is come together publicly. And I think that's really, really striking. I think it's not an accident that the Black Lives Matter protests this spring and summer were the biggest they've ever been, after we'd all been locked down and we'd all just been like watching the government be totally cool with mass death. And like, we know who was much more likely to die, right? As Black and brown people are more likely to die of this thing. But also we've just been so isolated that like, that I remember going to my first big march in Philly and just being like, oh my God, people. Oh my God, being in a space around people where we all share something. And the reporting that I've done in factories that are closing or that have closed, and talked to people who worked at Carrier or worked at Lordstown, and you ask people like what they're going to miss, and it is everyone, right? It's the collective, it's the union, it's the solidarity, it's being part of something. That these are, I think, really foundational human needs that, oh my goodness, I keep forgetting the name of this woman. I've got to write it down. I was listening to Doug Henwood's show, and he was interviewing a woman who was a researcher of loneliness, who was talking about like being alone actually like physically sends you into fight or flight mode. And I'm like, oh, is that why I've been so irritable the last few months? It makes sense, right? That we need that connection. And that as much as anything is the kind of meaning that we're seeking in so many places. And so how do we take that back from the boss, right? Like, gosh, I was talking to a nurse, and I forget who it was, where we were talking about nursing organizing, right? That like when you are working in the hospital wants all the nurses to work together well, and that's necessary for the hospital to work well. And so if you can turn that to your own purpose, you end up with really, really strong unions, which is one of the reasons that nurses unions are also some of the most powerful unions right now. Whereas if you're sort of isolated freelance journalists, we are all pitted against each other and in competition, and it's much harder to actually turn that to organizing, which is why it's amazing that it's been happening lately, because it's sort of counter to the way capitalism has already shaped us. Whereas like industrial unions are taking the thing that capitalism has already done, which is put a shitload of people in one factory and then turning that into a union. This is the class composition stuff again, and I'm rambling a little bit, but I think this is really important because it's also why we should understand that like, it's not an accident that most workplaces now don't have enough workers to show up on the strike guidelines, right? Or the strike statistics, because they have deliberately isolated us into smaller and smaller groups. And last thing, and then I'll stop rambling about this question, was I was talking to an organizer the other day who works with Amazon workers in the warehouses, and he was saying that Amazon has been very, very smart about using social distancing as a disciplinary measure. So workers who are organizing and thus talking to each other on the job are getting written up and fired for violating social distancing guidelines. So yeah, they are very, very aware that they need us separate, because when we get together, despite all of the ideological garbage that we've been fed, it's actually powerful and people connect.
Do you have time for one more? Okay.
Yes.
We'll do one more, and then we'll do some other sort of announcements and things. So I'll do with the newest one. Could you talk about the technology and the surveillance software and workers?
Yes, your boss is a cop. It's really just awful, and it's sort of at all levels of the workplace, right? That like there's everything from, you know, keystroke technology that like literally tracks what you're typing on your workplace computer. Never ever use your work email for organizing, by the way, and probably don't use your work laptop if your boss actually gave you one. To the, oh God, I keep thinking about this story. I was on a panel, in fact, one of the panels that were structured like this, with a postal worker and union steward in the UK. And she was talking about the scanner gadget that they have, and it has like a yellow dot on it. And if you take too long at any one stop dropping off your package, the dot starts getting bigger and bigger and takes over the whole screen on your thing and just gets more and more annoying. And she was saying, you know, she's like, as the postal worker, like sometimes people stop to ask me for directions. Sometimes, you know, I deliver something and people want to chat because they're nice people. Like all of these things that made the job less sucky are now, you know, being taken away by this awful like yellow dot just growing on your screen. You know, UPS and other driver companies, they use similar things. So, you know, a few years ago when I was living in a different part of Brooklyn, I started to notice that like my packages weren't getting delivered. And then a little while later, Esther Kaplan wrote this long piece about how UPS was now using really strict GPS and timing software. So literally like the drivers were getting timed so strictly that they were just coming and sort of dropping the package on the doorstep and leaving it, you know, it was getting stolen because it was Brooklyn. And, you know, so all of these things that are variously getting used with mixed results for actually making the job more efficient, but very good results in terms of making workers more scared, more anxious, and more miserable. And it sucks. And they're only trying to do more of it. And this is the sort of the broader question about automation and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing is like right now, the technology that is being created is going to be shaped like capitalism. So it's going to be shaped like what the bosses want it to be. So rather than like a GPS program for a delivery driver that might make it easier for the delivery driver to get you your package and make sure it gets into your hands. We're coming up with something that just makes sure that they have to deliver like 80 packages an hour or whatever the, you know, ridiculous number might be. Smile scanners. This is my least favorite of a long litany of evil workplace technology. Is literally, it was a Japanese company that used actual smile scanners to make sure people are smiling enough. Somebody in the comments is saying we signed into our cash register and the clocking system with our fingerprints. Are you kidding me? Heat sensors in retail that will tell the boss where people are on the floor so they can dispatch workers to that part of the floor. Those things can also tell you if the workers are smiling. Yeah, it's all a nightmare, and it all pretty much does nothing to make your job any easier, and just, you know, mostly makes it more miserable and gives your boss more control. So on that note, I will recommend Gavin Mueller's book, Breaking Things at Work. Not that I'm encouraging anybody to commit sabotage.
Only to read. So speaking of books, if you want to get Sarah's book, I just put the link for that, for the bookshop, in the chat. You should check it out. In all likelihood, we're going to do a reading group for that here, and you will all be invited. So you should get a hold of it and be a part of that and can continue this conversation. I think we have someone from the labor group to make an announcement, possibly Sam.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
The best part about our fingerprint system at the store was that they made us do backup fingerprints into the system. You know, just in case. So hi, everyone. My name is Sam Nelson. I'm the co-chair of our labor working group for the chapter. I'm just going to read off what we have coming up in case you're interested, including a number of things that are relevant to tonight's discussion. First is Wednesday is our monthly workplace organizing workshop. It's an open space where if you're interested in organizing your workplace, or if you want to use your organizing skills for good, you can come and you know, talk about how to talk to your coworkers, map your workplace, or get paired up with someone who is going through that, and you can help them move along in the process of organizing into a union or some other kind of thing. Then Monday the 1st, and those workshops are every month at the last Wednesday of the month. Monday is our monthly labor speaker series, where we're going to have Katie Parker and Ethan Miller, who are officers in the Nonprofit Professional Employees Union in DC. They're going to talk about organizing nonprofits, particularly during COVID in DC, the difference a union makes and kind of what that actually entails having a union in the workplace kind of day to day is. Should be an awesome discussion. If you're interested in general in getting involved with the labor working group, you can reach out to us at labor@mdcdsa.org. We also have a sign up form in the Slack channel. It's the topic at the top. And then just for a big mobilization that we are, a couple of big things that we're looking to bring a lot of people into. One is we're going to be organizing around the PRO Act, which has the potential to be the best labor law reform in decades. If you want to get involved, you can find it on the Slack at #ProAct or reach out to the working group. Ditto with Defund Metropolitan Police. There are bi-weekly meetings on reaching out to unions to support defunding the police. And then, so Virginia, noted not labor-friendly state, passed a law that allows cities and counties to grant collective bargaining rights to the public employees. And Alexandria, just across the river, is looking to be the first one. So we are currently working with AFSCME and the firefighters union there to mobilize a shit ton of our members into the public comment period on March 13th. So expect ways to sign up for that. But basically, if we can have that first floodgate open in Alexandria, it could spark a wave of public sector collective bargaining in Virginia, which would fundamentally shift power in good ways in the state. So again, you can find us on Slack at #labor or reach out to us at labor@mdcdsa.org. Thanks, and thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sam. If you're interested in reading Marx's Capital, Volume 1, we got a reading group going for that that's going to be starting next month. And I have just put the link for that in the chat. If you're interested, check it out. We are almost done. If you're interested in getting involved or more involved in Metro DC DSA, you can do so here at our new members forum. If you're interested in learning more about, if you want to contact the political education team here, our night school team, you can do it here at our email. And then one more. You can check us out on YouTube, but also if you want to find past events, including video and like extra readings and things like that, you can do that on our website there. And so with that, I'm going to end this. Thank you so much to Sarah. Thank you to everyone else for coming and being a part and being an active participant. Thank you and have a good night.
Thanks.